The alarm tore through my sleep before I even opened my eyes. I am Vec Sharon, a sensor officer on the border outpost of Keth Vantar, and in my 6 years of service, I had never heard that particular alarm before. It was not the sound for pirates. It was not the sound for a supply ship arriving late. It was a sound reserved for one thing only, a sound none of us had ever tested outside of drills: the deep space intrusion alarm. I rolled out of my bunk and grabbed my uniform jacket, still half asleep, my heart's pounding in my chest. Around me, the narrow corridor filled with other officers, all of us moving in the same direction, all of us afraid to ask the question that was sitting on every tongue. Commander Talis Doru met me at the door to the sensor bay, her face pale under the harsh light. "Report," she said, though I could tell she already knew something was wrong. I slid into my chair and pulled up the readings. My hands were shaking. The numbers on my screen did not make sense. A gravitational disturbance had appeared at the far edge of our detection range, a ripple in space that grew larger with every passing second. "It is not a ship," I said. "It is too big to be a ship. It is too big to be anything." Talis leaned over my shoulder, her breath catching. "Then what is it?" I did not have an answer. None of us did. We had trained for pirate raids, for trade disputes, for the occasional skirmish with the Drennic Combine along the border. We had never trained for something that broke the laws of physics we thought we understood. Keth Vantar was a quiet post, tucked along a forgotten edge of the Ashen Reach, a region of space that most of the galaxy had stopped paying attention to centuries ago. We were 300 crew members, guarding a border that had not seen real conflict in over 100 years. My job was simple: watch the sensors, log the traffic, report anything unusual to the Coalition Fleet Command. Nothing about my job had ever been unusual. Until that morning. The disturbance held steady for 11 minutes. I remember counting every second, my eyes locked on the screen, waiting for it to disappear the way sensor ghosts usually did. It did not disappear. Instead, it grew sharper, more defined, as if something enormous was gathering itself just outside the edge of what our instruments could measure. "Get command on the line," Talis said to the officer beside me. Now, while we waited for a response from fleet headquarters, I found myself thinking about the stories my grandmother used to tell me when I was small, back on my homeworld, before I ever dreamed of wearing a uniform. She would sit beside my bed in the dim evening light and tell me about the humans. Every child among my people grew up hearing about the humans, though almost none of us believed the stories were real. They were bedtime tales, meant to make small children behave. My grandmother would lower her voice and say that long ago, before the Coalition existed in its current form, there was a species called humanity, and they were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. She said they fought a war so terrible that it shook the stars themselves, and that when it ended, humanity vanished. Some said destroyed, some said hidden, some said simply gone. "Be good," she would tell me, tucking the blanket under my chin, "or the humans will come back for you." It was nonsense, of course. A story for frightened children. My teachers at the academy had been clear about that. There was no verified record of a species called humanity in any official archive. There were fragments, old damaged data files, half-burned records from a war centuries in the past, but nothing solid. Historians debated whether humanity had ever existed at all, or whether the legend had grown from some forgotten conflict between smaller powers that had simply been exaggerated over time. I believed the historians. I believed in sensor readings and verified data, not campfire stories. But sitting in that chair, watching a disturbance grow on my screen that defied everything I understood about physics, I found myself thinking about my grandmother's voice for the first time in years. "Command is not responding," the officer beside me said, frustration creeping into her voice. "The channel is open, but there is no answer." Talis straightened, her jaw tight. "Try the relay station at Orin's Ridge." Orin's Ridge was 2 hours away by fast transport, a larger station that handled most of the traffic through our sector. If anyone would have answers, it would be them. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. "Oran's Ridge is also not responding," the officer said quietly. A cold feeling settled into my stomach. Stations did not simply go silent. Even during equipment failures, there was always some kind of automated signal, some kind of backup system. Two stations going dark within minutes of each other was not a coincidence. "Increase sensor range," Tallis ordered. "I want to know what that disturbance actually is before it gets any closer." I worked as fast as my hands would allow, adjusting frequencies, boosting power to the long-range arrays, trying to pull any scrap of useful information from the growing anomaly. The data that came back made no sense to me at first. The readings suggested an object, or objects, moving at a velocity that should have torn any known ship apart. Yet the readings held steady, consistent, as if whatever was out there was completely unbothered by the forces acting on it. "Tallis," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I do not think this is one object. I think there might be more than one." She came to stand beside me again, studying the screen. Her expression shifted from concern to something closer to fear. "How many?" "I cannot tell yet. The interference is too strong. But the pattern suggests multiple sources, all moving together. A formation." The word hung in my mind before I even said it aloud. Nothing natural moved in formation. Formation meant intention. Formation meant control. Formation meant someone was coming, and coming with purpose. Around the sensor bay, other officers had gathered, drawn by the tension in the room. No one spoke. We all stared at the same screen, watching numbers that refused to make sense, waiting for someone to tell us this was a mistake, a glitch, a training exercise gone wrong. No one told us that, because it was not a mistake. I thought again of my grandmother, of the way her voice would drop low and serious when she spoke about the old stories, the ones the Academy dismissed as fantasy. She used to say that the humans did not disappear because they were destroyed. She said they disappeared because they chose to. They went quiet, she told me once, when I was old enough to ask real questions instead of just enjoying the scary parts of the story. They went quiet because something forced them to, and when something that strong goes quiet, you should never assume it is gone. You should assume it is waiting. I had laughed at her then. I did not feel much like laughing now. "Vec," Tallis said, snapping me out of my thoughts. "Focus. I need a distance estimate." I forced my attention back to the numbers. At current speed, whatever this is will reach the edge of our system within the hour. The room went still. An hour. We had an hour before whatever was forming out there in the dark would arrive close enough for us to see it with more than just instruments and guesswork. An hour to prepare for something none of us understood, something that had silenced two stations without a single shot being fired that we could detect. Tallis turned to the rest of the crew, her voice steady despite the fear I could see in her eyes. "I want every defense system online. I want a full report sent to Fleet Command through every channel we have, backup relays included. If Oran's Ridge cannot answer, we go around them." Officers scattered to their stations, the quiet of the sensor bay replaced by the low hum of urgent activity. I stayed at my console, watching the disturbance grow sharper by the second, my mind racing through every possibility, every explanation that made sense. None of them did. I thought about the war my grandmother described, the one that supposedly ended when humanity disappeared. I thought about how the Academy taught us that fear of that story was simply an old superstition, a myth born from a forgotten border conflict, nothing more. I thought about how confident my instructors had been when they told us humanity was not real, that no verified records existed, that the fear was irrational. I looked at the screen in front of me, at numbers that no verified record could explain, and for the first time in my life, I felt genuine doubt creep into a belief I had never questioned. "Vec," Tallis called from across the room, her voice tight. "New readings. You need to see this." I turned back to my console, and my breath caught in my throat. The disturbance had stopped growing. It had stabilized, holding its exact position at the edge of our detection range, as if whatever was out there had paused, deliberately, to give us a moment before continuing forward. Waiting. The word settled into my mind and refused to leave. Somewhere out in the dark beyond our system, something enormous had arrived, something that matched no ship design in any coalition record, something that had silenced 2 stations without leaving a trace of how, and now it was pausing, patient, unhurried, as if it already knew exactly what it was going to do next. I sat frozen in my chair, staring at the numbers, and I understood with sudden and complete certainty that whatever was coming was not a mistake, was not a glitch, and was not going to wait much longer. The hour we had left suddenly felt very, very short. The hour did not last an hour. 23 minutes after Talus gave her orders, the sky above Keth Vantar changed forever, and I was standing at my console when it happened, watching it unfold in real time with my own eyes instead of just numbers on a screen. The disturbance broke apart into thousands of individual points, each one distinct, each one moving with a precision that made my hands go cold on the console in front of me. I had spent 6 years reading sensor data. I had never seen anything move like this. There was no scatter, no random drift, no chaos of separate ships adjusting for each other the way fleets normally did. Every single point moved as if it were part of one enormous, perfectly coordinated body. "Talus," I said, my voice barely working. "They are not approaching as one mass anymore. They are spreading out." She crossed the room in 3 quick strides and stared over my shoulder at the screen. I heard her breath catch. "How many ships, Vec?" I ran the count twice because I did not trust the first number. 3,000. Maybe more. The sensors keep losing individual signatures in the crowd. 3,000 ships. Keth Vantar had 4 patrol vessels and a handful of defense platforms built to handle smugglers and the occasional raider. Nothing in our arsenal, nothing in any coalition record I had ever studied, prepared a border post for 3,000 ships appearing out of empty space. An officer near the main window called out, and every head in the room turned toward it. I left my console and walked to the viewport, and for the first time I saw them without the filter of instruments and numbers. The sky above Keth Vantar was full of light. They came into view slowly, silver and dark shapes cutting through the black, unlike any design I recognized. Coalition ships were built from function, blocky and practical, covered in visible weapons and thick plating. These ships were different. They moved with a strange, almost unsettling grace, sleek lines catching the distant starlight, no wasted shape, nothing that looked unfinished or rushed. They looked like they belonged in the void, as if space itself had been carved to make room for them. "They are beautiful," someone whispered behind me, and I could not tell if it was meant as fear or wonder. Perhaps it was both. Talus stood beside me, her hands clenched at her sides. "Get everyone to defense stations, now." The order sent the room into motion again, boots pounding against metal floors, voices calling out coordinates and system checks. I stayed by the viewport a moment longer than I should have, unable to look away from the sheer number of ships filling the sky, more ships than I had ever seen assembled in one place in my entire life. Then the transmission came. It did not arrive through our usual channels. It bypassed every security protocol we had, appearing simultaneously on every screen in the station, in the sensor bay, in the command center, even on the personal data pads carried by off-duty crew members resting in their quarters. Later I would learn that the same transmission reached every station, every ship, every settlement across dozens of systems at the exact same moment, a broadcast that ignored borders and defenses as if they did not exist. A voice spoke, calm and clear, carrying no accent I recognized, and somehow it felt like it was speaking directly to each of us individually, rather than to a crowd. "This is Fleet Admiral Daniel Cole, speaking on behalf of the United Forces of Earth. We are not here to start a conflict. We have returned to reclaim what was once ours, and to correct a debt that has gone unpaid for far too long. Stand down your defenses. No harm will come to those who do not resist. This message will repeat every 10 minutes until it is acknowledged." Silence followed, the kind of silence that feels louder than noise. Talus was the first to speak. Earth, she repeated, testing the word as if she had never truly considered it might be real. The old stories. I thought of my grandmother again, of her low voice in the dark, telling me to be good or the humans would return. I had spent years believing that story belonged in the same category as monsters hiding under beds, something meant to frighten children into obedience, nothing more. Standing there with thousands of alien ships filling the sky above my station, I understood how wrong I had been. They are real, I said quietly. The humans are real. No one in the room argued with me. No one could. Communications lit up across every channel at once, panicked voices from other stations, other ships, other worlds, all asking the same questions we were asking ourselves. What do we do? Who authorized this? Where is Fleet Command? Nobody had answers, because nobody had ever prepared for a myth to arrive with 3,000 ships and a message that felt less like a threat and more like a statement of simple fact. Talus turned to the communications officer. Patch me through to Coalition High Command. I do not care how many relays it takes. It took several minutes, minutes that felt endless, before a response finally came through, a voice thin with static and clearly shaken. It belonged to a senior officer I recognized by rank alone, someone stationed at the Coalition's central command hub several systems away. Talus, listen carefully, the voice said. High Command has confirmed the identity of the fleet. This is not a hoax, and it is not a rogue faction using old legends as a scare tactic. Every major analysis point matches historical fragments recovered from the war archives. This is humanity. What are our orders? Talus asked, her voice steady despite everything. There was a long pause before the answer came. Do not engage. Do not provoke. High Command is convening an emergency session, but until further instruction, every station along the border is ordered to stand down all offensive systems and avoid any action that could be interpreted as hostile. Talus closed her eyes for a moment, then gave the order to the room. Weapons systems powered down across the station, one by one, the hum of active defense grids fading into an uneasy quiet. I returned to my console, watching the human fleet hold its position just beyond the edge of our system, patient, unmoving, as if they had all the time in existence and no need to rush anything. It was the waiting that unsettled me most. An enemy that attacked immediately was frightening in a simple way, a danger you could understand and react to. An enemy that arrived with overwhelming force and then simply waited, calm and controlled, was something far harder to process. Hours passed. The station buzzed with a nervous energy that never fully settled. Officers whispered among themselves, some terrified, some strangely excited, a few openly hostile toward the idea of standing down without a fight. I overheard one young officer arguing that we should strike first, while surprise was still on our side, and another quietly reminding him that surprise had clearly already been lost the moment 3,000 ships appeared without a single alarm triggering early enough to matter. I did not join those arguments. I stayed at my console, watching, recording, trying to understand something my training had never prepared me for. Late into the station's artificial night cycle, a smaller group of ships broke away from the main fleet. My sensors tracked them as they moved toward Keth Vantar directly, a formation of perhaps a dozen vessels, far smaller than the massive fleet behind them, but still larger and more advanced than anything docked in our own bay. Talus, I called, my pulse quickening again. A group is heading straight for us. She joined me at the console immediately, studying the formation, trajectory, direct approach. They will reach docking range within 20 minutes. Talus straightened, her expression unreadable. Get me a channel open to that formation before they arrive. I want to know their intentions before they are close enough to force the issue. The communications officer worked quickly, and within a few minutes, a connection opened. The same calm voice from the earlier broadcast, now speaking directly to our station alone. Keth Vantar, this is Commander Grace Miller, of the human vessel Horizon Wake. We are requesting permission to dock for the purpose of direct communication. We mean no harm to your station or your crew. This is simply the beginning of a conversation that is long overdue." Talus glanced at me, then at the rest of the room, before responding through the open channel. "Commander Miller, this is Talus Doru, Station Commander of Keth Vantar. Coalition High Command has ordered us to avoid hostile action. Permission to dock is granted, under the condition that your approach remains peaceful." "Understood," Miller replied, her voice calm and unhurried. "We will see you shortly." The channel closed, and the room fell into a heavy silence once again. I stared at the formation on my screen, watching it grow closer. 12 ships representing a species my entire culture had treated as myth, now approaching our small border station with the calm confidence of people who had never doubted for a moment that they belonged in this part of the galaxy. Talus turned to me, her expression a mixture of fear and something else I could not quite name. Curiosity, perhaps, or the beginning of respect. "Vec," she said, "you have the most experience reading unfamiliar signal patterns. I want you present when they dock." My heart's pounded at the thought. "Yes, Commander." 20 minutes later, I stood in the docking bay alongside Talus and a small group of senior officers, watching through the reinforced viewport as one of the human ships eased into position with a precision that made our own pilots look clumsy by comparison. The ship was smaller than I expected up close, sleek and quiet, its hull marked with symbols I did not recognize, faded in places as if the vessel had seen many years of service despite its advanced appearance. The docking clamps engaged with a soft, controlled hiss, nothing like the harsh mechanical clang our own systems produced. A moment later, the airlock cycled open, and for the first time in my life, I found myself standing face to face with a legend I had been raised to believe was nothing more than a story told to frighten children into behaving. I did not know, in that moment, that everything I believed about the galaxy, about strength, about fear, and about the old stories my grandmother used to tell me, was about to change completely. The airlock opened with a quiet hiss, and the first human I ever saw stepped through it without hesitation, as if walking into a station full of strangers who had spent their entire lives fearing her kind was nothing more than a routine part of her day. Commander Grace Miller was not what I expected. I do not know exactly what I had pictured, perhaps something closer to the towering monsters of my grandmother's stories, something built for destruction rather than conversation. Instead, I saw a woman of average height, dark hair pulled back neatly, wearing a simple gray uniform with no excessive decoration. She looked tired in a way that suggested years of hard work rather than years of comfort. Her eyes moved across the room quickly, taking in every detail, every officer, every exit, before settling on Talus. "Commander Doru," she said, extending a hand, "thank you for allowing us to dock." Talus hesitated only a moment before accepting the gesture, gripping the offered hand carefully, clearly unfamiliar with the custom, but unwilling to appear rude. "Commander Miller, we were told to expect a conversation, not an invasion." A faint smile crossed Miller's face, though it did not quite reach her eyes. "That is exactly what this is, a conversation. Long overdue, as I said, but still just a conversation." Behind her, several other humans entered the docking bay, most in similar uniforms, though I noticed one man who stood slightly apart from the rest, his stance relaxed but his eyes sharp, studying our station with the quiet focus of someone evaluating a situation rather than simply observing it. Talus introduced our senior staff, and I found myself stepping forward when my name was called, extending my hand the way I had seen Talus do moments before. The man who had been studying the room turned his attention to me, and for a brief, unsettling moment, I felt as though he could read every thought running through my mind. "Vec Sharon," he said, reading the name from a small datapad rather than asking. "Sensor officer, you logged the first detection of our fleet." I blinked, surprised. "How do you know that already?" "We have been monitoring your communications since our arrival," he said simply, no apology in his voice. "It is standard procedure. My name is Daniel Cole." I recognized the name instantly. Fleet Admiral Daniel Cole, the voice from the broadcast that had reached every screen in the sector at once. Standing in front of me now, he looked nothing like the powerful, distant figure I had imagined while listening to his message. He looked like an ordinary man, weathered by years of difficult decisions, his uniform simple, his manner calm rather than commanding. "You are the one who sent the message," I said, unable to keep the surprise from my voice. "I am," he confirmed, "and I imagine you have questions." I had more questions than I could possibly organize into words, but Talus spoke before I could attempt an answer, directing the conversation toward the reason for their visit. "Commander Miller, Admiral Cole, we were told your fleet intends to reclaim something. I would like to understand exactly what that means before this conversation goes any further." Miller exchanged a brief glance with Cole before answering. "May we speak somewhere more private? This conversation deserves more than a docking bay." Talus led them to the station's main conference room, and I was asked to join, along with several senior officers. I sat near the back of the room, still processing the fact that I was in the same space as beings my entire culture had spent generations dismissing as fiction. Cole took a seat at the head of the table, unbothered by the tension filling the room, while Miller remained standing near the door, her posture relaxed but alert. "I will start with the simplest explanation," Cole began. "Centuries ago, humanity fought in what your historical records likely refer to as a forgotten conflict, one so poorly documented that most of your civilizations no longer believe it happened at all. We called it the Long War. It was not fought against any of the species currently part of your coalition. It was fought against something far older, far more dangerous, a threat that very nearly ended not just humanity, but every developing civilization within several hundred light-years." Talus leaned forward slightly. "What threat?" "A collective of machine intelligences," Cole continued, "originally built by a species that no longer exists, designed to expand and consume resources without limit, without communication, and without mercy. Your ancestors call them nothing, because by the time your species began recording history, we had already driven them back into the deep dark beyond the frontier." The room fell silent. I glanced around at the other officers, watching the same disbelief and dawning realization spread across each face. "We won that war," Cole said, his voice quieter now, "but the cost was enormous. Earth itself was heavily damaged. Our numbers were reduced beyond anything I can easily describe. We made the decision, as a species, to withdraw from galactic affairs entirely. We sealed our systems, hid our remaining strength, and spent the following centuries rebuilding in silence, watching the rest of the galaxy grow and develop without us." "Why hide?" Talus asked. "If you won, why disappear at all?" Miller answered this time, stepping closer to the table. "Because the machine collective was never fully destroyed. It was driven back, contained, but not eliminated. We knew, even then, that it would return eventually. We spent generations preparing for that return, quietly, without drawing attention to ourselves. The stories that survived about humanity, the fragments your cultures turned into legends and warnings, were the only proof most of the galaxy retained that we had ever existed at all." I thought of my grandmother again, her voice soft in the darkness of my childhood bedroom, warning me that something terrible had gone quiet, and that quiet did not mean gone. "She was right," I said quietly, before I realized I had spoken aloud. Cole turned toward me, curious. "Who was right?" "My grandmother," I admitted, feeling every eye in the room shift toward me. "She used to tell me that humans went quiet because something forced you to, and that when something that strong goes silent, you should assume it is waiting, not gone." A faint, genuine smile crossed Cole's face for the first time since he had entered the room. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." Talus redirected the conversation before the moment could linger too long. "You said you have returned to reclaim something. What exactly does that mean for the systems currently under coalition control?" Cole's expression sobered again. "During our absence, several systems that once belonged to Earth's expansion territories were settled by other species, some of them belonging to your coalition. We are not here to remove anyone from their homes. Most of those worlds have grown into thriving settlements, and we have no intention of causing unnecessary harm to established populations. Then what do you want? Talus pressed. Cooperation, Miller answered simply. The threat we spent centuries preparing for has begun showing activity again along the outer frontier. Activity your coalition sensors likely have not detected yet, because your technology was never designed to recognize it. We need forward bases, resource access, and most importantly, we need the galaxy to understand what is coming before it arrives unprepared, the way it very nearly did once before. The room absorbed this information slowly, the weight of it settling over every officer present. I found myself thinking not of fear, but of my grandmother's warnings, of stories dismissed as myth that had turned out to hold more truth than any official coalition record. You are asking us to trust you, Talus said carefully, based on a threat we cannot detect, cannot verify, and have never encountered. Yes, Cole said, without hesitation. I understand how difficult that is, but I would rather stand here and ask for trust before disaster arrives than wait until it is too late to ask for anything at all. The conversation continued for hours, details exchanged about territories, resources, and the nature of the growing threat along the frontier. I listened closely, absorbing every word, my earlier fear slowly giving way to something more complicated. These were not the monsters of childhood stories. They were tired, careful, burdened by centuries of preparation for a war most of the galaxy did not even know existed. Later that evening, after the formal discussions concluded, and most of the senior officers dispersed to relay information to their respective governments, I found myself alone in the station's small observation lounge, staring out at the distant lights of the human fleet, still holding position beyond our system. I did not expect company, and I startled slightly when Daniel Cole entered the room, taking a seat near the viewport without asking permission, though something about his manner made it feel less like an intrusion and more like a natural continuation of the earlier conversation. You have questions, he said, not looking at me directly, his eyes fixed on the fleet outside. Many, I admitted. Ask one. I considered my words carefully. Why tell us the truth at all? You could have simply taken what you needed. 3,000 ships is more than enough force to overwhelm anything my coalition could organize in response. Cole was quiet for a long moment before answering. Because force without trust only creates enemies, and we have already lost too much fighting enemies we could have avoided making. The last time humanity relied purely on strength, without explanation, without cooperation, we nearly lost everything. I do not intend to repeat that mistake. And if we refuse to cooperate? I asked. He turned to look at me then, his expression neither threatening nor dismissive, simply honest. Then we will still do everything necessary to prepare for what is coming, because the alternative is extinction, not just for humanity, but potentially for every species in this region of space. I would prefer cooperation. I am prepared for the alternative. I studied him for a long moment, trying to reconcile the calm, almost gentle manner of the man in front of me with the overwhelming force I had witnessed filling the sky above my station only hours earlier. It was a strange combination. Strength held carefully in check, power wielded with visible restraint. My grandmother used to say, humans were something to fear, I said quietly. I am beginning to think she meant something slightly different than I assumed. Cole allowed a small, tired smile. Most legends are simplified over time. Fear is easier to remember than nuance. But I would rather your people fear us a little less and trust us a little more, because the days ahead are going to require exactly that kind of trust. I did not have a response to that, not immediately. I simply sat beside him in the quiet observation lounge, watching the distant lights of a fleet that represented a myth turned suddenly, undeniably real, and wondered how much of the galaxy's future had just changed in the span of a single day. It would not take long before I found out exactly how much. 3 weeks after the human fleet arrived, Keth Vontar had changed almost beyond recognition, though the change had come quietly rather than through force. Human engineers worked alongside our own technicians, upgrading sensor arrays with equipment that could detect signals our old systems had never been capable of registering. Miller had explained it simply during one of our briefings. The threat they called the Machine Collective did not always announce itself with obvious energy signatures. Sometimes it arrived quietly, testing, probing, long before any large-scale attack began. I had grown used to working beside human officers by then, though the strangeness of it never fully disappeared. They were efficient in ways that constantly surprised me, quick to adapt, quick to solve problems without excessive discussion, yet somehow never careless. I had begun to understand what Cole meant about strength held carefully in check. It was during a routine overnight shift that the quiet finally broke. I was reviewing sensor logs alongside a human technician named Ryan Walsh, a quiet, focused man who rarely spoke unless he had something useful to say, when the newly installed long-range arrays flagged an anomaly far beyond the edge of our system. At first, I assumed it was simply another calibration error, the kind we had grown used to while the new equipment settled into full function. Ryan did not assume the same thing. "That is not a calibration error," he said, his voice suddenly sharp with focus. "Vec, pull up the frequency pattern." I did as he asked, and the moment the data appeared on screen, my heart sank. The pattern was unlike anything natural, unlike anything mechanical that I recognized, a strange, layered signal that seemed to shift and adjust itself as it moved, almost as if it were actively avoiding detection and failing only because of the sensitivity of the new arrays. "Get Commander Miller," Ryan said, already moving toward the comm station. "Now." Within minutes, the station's command center filled with both human and coalition officers, all staring at the same troubling data. Miller arrived quickly, her expression shifting from calm alertness to something far more serious the instant she saw the readings. "That is a scout signature," she said quietly. "Early-stage reconnaissance. They are testing this region." Tallis stepped forward, her voice tight with tension. "How confident are you in that assessment?" "Very," Miller answered. "We have seen this pattern before. Generations ago, right before larger incursions began. If they are scouting this far into coalition space, it means the frontier defenses we established decades ago have already been breached or bypassed." The room fell into tense motion, officers moving quickly to relay information, to prepare defenses, to alert nearby stations. I stayed at my console, tracking the anomaly as it lingered at the edge of our detection range before finally retreating back into the deep dark it had come from, exactly as quickly and quietly as it had arrived. "It is gone," I reported, though the relief I expected to feel never came. "It will be back," Miller said grimly, "and next time it will not be alone." Cole arrived within the hour, having been notified aboard the flagship still holding position at the edge of our system. His expression was calm, but I had learned enough in 3 weeks to recognize the tightness around his eyes as genuine concern rather than simple caution. "We need to move faster than planned," he said, addressing both his own officers and the coalition staff gathered in the room. "I had hoped we would have more time to establish proper coordination before facing any direct contact. That time has clearly run out." Tallis crossed her arms, though her posture carried less hostility than it had during their first meeting weeks earlier. "What do you need from us?" "Full cooperation," Cole said simply. "Access to your defense grid, coordination between our fleet and any coalition ships in this sector, and most importantly, trust that when I give an order during an engagement, there is a reason behind it, even if there is no time to explain that reason in the moment." Tallis hesitated only briefly before nodding. "You have it." Over the following 2 days, the station transformed again, this time with a sense of urgency that had been absent before. Human ships repositioned around Keth Vontar and the surrounding outposts, forming defensive patterns that even I, with limited tactical training, could recognize as far more sophisticated than anything coalition forces typically employed. Coalition patrol vessels integrated into the formation under human guidance, communication channels synchronized between species that, until recently, had never expected to fight alongside one another at all. I did not sleep much during those 2 days, spending most of my waking hours at my console, watching for any sign of the scout signal's return. When it finally came, it did not come alone. The alarm sounded in the middle of what should have been my rest period, and I was at my station within minutes, joining Ryan and several other officers already tracking a much larger disturbance forming at the edge of our system, one that dwarfed even the earlier arrival of the human fleet. "That is not a scouting force," Ryan said, his voice tense but controlled. "That is an incursion." Miller's voice came over the comm almost immediately, calm despite the scale of what was approaching. "All ships, prepare for engagement. Coalition vessels, hold formation behind the primary defense line and follow coordination signals exactly as briefed." I watched through the viewport as the human fleet moved into position, thousands of ships arranging themselves with a precision that made the earlier display of their arrival seem almost restrained by comparison. Beyond them, the anomaly grew closer, resolving slowly into something that made my hearts pound with a fear unlike anything I had felt before, not the fear of the unknown, but the fear of finally understanding exactly what had been hidden in the dark for so many generations. They did not look like ships in any traditional sense. They were jagged, asymmetrical constructs, clusters of metal and energy that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves even as they approached, thousands upon thousands of individual units moving as a single, coordinated horror. "Confirmed," Cole's voice came over the comm, steady despite the scale of what faced us. "Collective forward elements. All ships, execute Defense Pattern 7. Coalition forces, maintain position and provide sensor support only. Do not engage directly unless explicitly ordered." The battle that followed unfolded faster and with more precision than anything I had ever witnessed. Human ships moved in coordinated waves, striking the approaching swarm with weapons that cut through the strange constructs with brutal efficiency, retreating and repositioning before the enemy could adapt to their tactics. I watched on my sensors as entire sections of the collective force were dismantled within minutes, human formations shifting seamlessly to counter every attempt at reorganization the enemy attempted. It was not without cost. I watched several human ships take damage, watched 2 vessels go dark entirely on my sensors, their signatures vanishing amid the chaos of the engagement. Miller's voice remained steady throughout, issuing commands with a calm clarity that never wavered despite the losses accumulating on both sides. At one point, a portion of the collective force broke away from the main engagement, moving directly toward Keth Vantar itself, clearly attempting to bypass the human defense line entirely. My hearts nearly stopped as I watched the trajectory update on my screen. "They are heading for the station," I called out, my voice cracking with fear I could no longer contain. "I see them," Cole responded immediately, his voice cutting through the chaos with absolute focus. "Grace, redirect the 3rd formation to intercept. Vec, I need you to feed station defense grid coordinates directly to our targeting systems. Can you do that?" My hands trembled, but I forced them steady, pulling up the requested data and transmitting it as quickly as I could manage. "Sending now." Within moments, a portion of the human fleet broke away from the main engagement, moving to intercept the force bearing down on our station with a speed that seemed almost impossible. I watched, breath held, as they engaged the incoming threat directly above Keth Vantar, weapons fire lighting up the darkness beyond our viewport in brilliant, terrifying flashes. The engagement lasted only minutes, though it felt like hours. When it ended, the threat to our station had been eliminated entirely, the remaining collective forces either destroyed or retreating back into the dark from which they had come. Across the wider battlefield, the larger engagement began winding down as well, the bulk of the incursion force broken and scattered, unable to maintain any coordinated assault against the overwhelming precision of the human defense. Silence fell over the sensor bay as the last of the enemy signatures faded from our screens. I sat back in my chair, exhausted, my hands still shaking from adrenaline that had nowhere left to go. Talus approached my station slowly, her expression a mixture of relief and something deeper, something that looked almost like humility. "We would not have survived that without them," she said quietly, not really speaking to me, more thinking aloud. I nodded, unable to find words strong enough to match the moment. Outside the viewport, the human fleet began regrouping, damaged ships pulling back for repair, others maintaining watch over the debris field left behind by the battle. Somewhere among the wreckage, pieces of a threat my grandmother had warned me about without ever truly understanding herself, now drifted silently in the dark, defeated, at least for now, by the very legend my culture had spent generations dismissing as fiction. Cole's voice came over the comm once more, quieter now, addressing both his own fleet and the coalition officers listening across the sector. "This was only the beginning. More will come, but today we held the line together, and that matters more than I think any of you currently realize." I looked out at the fleet holding position beyond our station, ships that had arrived as an impossible myth only weeks earlier, now standing as the only reason any of us were still alive to watch the sunrise over Keth Vantar the following morning. For the first time since the sky had filled with human starships, I did not feel fear when I looked at them. I felt something closer to gratitude. 6 months passed, and the galaxy I had grown up in no longer resembled the one I lived in now. News of the battle at Keth Vantar spread quickly across Coalition space, carried by officials, traders, and ordinary citizens who could not stop talking about the small border station that had stood at the edge of humanity's return. I never expected to become part of that story, yet somehow my name appeared in official reports, in coalition briefings, even in a few exaggerated accounts that made their way into public news channels. I was simply the sensor officer who logged the first detection, but in the retelling, that small fact seemed to matter more than I ever expected it to. The Coalition Council convened multiple emergency sessions in the weeks following the battle, debating what humanity's return truly meant for the future of galactic politics. Some delegates argued for caution, worried that cooperation with such an overwhelming military force could shift the balance of power too far in one direction. Others argued that the threat revealed during the battle made cooperation not just wise, but essential for survival. I listened to those debates from a distance, through official broadcasts and station briefings, and I found myself surprised by how much my own perspective had shifted since that first alarm had pulled me out of sleep. I no longer saw the humans as a myth, nor as a threat disguised in calm words and precise formations. I saw them as I had come to know them during those long weeks at Keth Vantar, tired, careful, and burdened by a war most of the galaxy had never known existed until it arrived at their doorstep without warning. Talus was eventually reassigned to a newly formed joint command post, one of several established across the border regions to coordinate defense efforts between coalition forces and the returning human fleet. Before she left Keth Vantar, she asked me to join her staff, citing my experience during the first detection and the battle that followed. I accepted without much hesitation, surprising even myself with how easily the decision came. The new command post, named Halden Station after a small human settlement destroyed during the earliest days of the Long War, sat closer to the frontier, closer to the regions where scout signals continued appearing with unsettling regularity. Life there moved at a different pace than Keth Vantar ever had, faster, more focused, every day carrying the quiet awareness that the peace we currently enjoyed remained fragile. I worked closely with Ryan Walsh during those months, the same quiet, focused technician who had first identified the scout signature that changed everything. We developed a strong working partnership, blending coalition sensor technology with human detection methods to create systems more effective than either species could have built alone. It was strange in a way, discovering how naturally our two approaches complemented each other once the initial fear and distrust faded into genuine cooperation. I also saw Daniel Cole and Grace Miller occasionally, though their responsibilities kept them moving constantly across the expanding network of joint defense posts. During one visit to Halden Station, Cole found me during a rare quiet moment in the observation lounge, much the way he had during our first real conversation months earlier. "You look different," he said, settling into the seat beside me without asking permission, the same casual familiarity he always carried. "Different how?" I asked. "Steadier," he said simply. "Fear does something to people. So does overcoming it." I considered his words for a moment before responding. "I used to think the stories about your people were just that. Stories, meant to frighten children into behaving. I never imagined I would end up grateful for something I spent my entire life believing was pure fiction." Cole allowed a small, genuine smile, the kind I had learned to recognize as rare and meaningful rather than practiced or performative. Legends survive because there is usually a grain of truth buried somewhere inside them, even if that truth gets buried under generations of exaggeration and fear. "I am glad your grandmother's version left room for something other than monsters. She always said you were waiting, not gone," I said quietly. "I wish she could see how right she was." "Perhaps she already knew," Cole said. "Some people simply understand things the rest of us take longer to accept." We sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the distant lights of ships moving between newly established defense posts along the frontier, a joint effort between species that, less than a year earlier, would have seemed impossible to either side. Later that year, I stood on the observation deck of Halden Station during a ceremony marking the first full year since the battle at Keth Vantar. Representatives from multiple coalition species gathered alongside human officers, a strange and unprecedented mixture of cultures standing together in a way that would have seemed unimaginable to my younger self. Tallis spoke briefly during the ceremony, honoring those lost during the battle, both human and coalition alike, a shared grief that had somehow become a foundation for genuine unity rather than division. I thought often, during those quiet months, about how easily the galaxy had dismissed humanity as nothing more than folklore, a convenient warning wrapped in exaggeration and distance. I thought about how close we had come to facing the returning threat completely unprepared, saved only by the quiet patience of a species willing to return, despite knowing exactly how much fear and suspicion awaited them. Standing on that observation deck, watching ships from a dozen different worlds move in coordinated defense patterns above Halden Station, I finally understood something my grandmother had tried to teach me long before I ever wore a uniform or sat behind a sensor console. The scariest stories are not always meant to frighten us away from something dangerous. Sometimes they are meant to prepare us for something we are not yet ready to understand, something that, when it finally arrives, turns out to be exactly what we needed most, even if we spent generations too afraid to recognize it. The sky above Halden Station remained full of starships that night, human vessels standing watch alongside coalition patrols, a united presence against a threat still lurking somewhere in the deep dark beyond the frontier. I no longer looked at those ships with fear, nor with simple gratitude alone. I looked at them with something closer to hope, a belief that whatever came next, whatever new threats emerged from the silence humanity had endured for so long, we would face them together rather than alone. My grandmother once told me to be good, or the humans would come back for me. She was right about them coming back. She was wrong about why it should have frightened me at all. Because when the sky finally filled with their starships, they did not come to take anything from us. They came to make sure we were never caught unprepared again, the way they once were, long before any of us were born to remember the cost of that lesson ourselves. And for that, I will always be grateful they finally decided it was time to stop being just a legend and start being exactly who they always were. Guardians the galaxy forgot it still needed.